Um, so I think we're ready to go. Just wanted to check that everyone's happy to be recorded today to make this a resource on the Link West website or YouTube page actually. If you just make a noise or anything if you're not happy with that.
Raise your hand if it's good.
Well, raise your hand if it's good.
Yeah.
That was a bit cool.
Yeah.
If you're all happy. We'll get started and I'll hand it over to you, Liz.
Great. Thanks, Joanna. So welcome everybody to this sixth session of Discovering Asset-Based Community Development. My name's Liz Nicholas and I work with Link West. And Link West is the peak body, as you all know, for neighbourhood centres and community resource centres in Western Australia. And we also have Joanna here from Link West. And today we have Peter Kenyon with us, and I'll tell you a little bit more about Peter, who you probably already know, in just a moment. I'd like to acknowledge that Link West office is on the land of the Whadjuk people, and we would like to extend our respect to elders past, present and emerging, and give our gratitude for the care that elders have extended to this country in the past and the care that they continue to extend. And we'd also like to tell the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders across Australia. So now we really are thrilled to welcome Peter Kenyon, and some of you may already have met him. I'm sure most of us know of his work. So Peter describes himself as a community enthusiast, a capitalist, and has worked in 59 countries with over 2,000 communities to date. And he's also worked tirelessly in Western Australia on behalf and as part of our communities and networks here. So, and he's also last year in 2017 received the Australian Senior Citizen of the Year award, I believe. And sorry, you were going to correct me?
Yeah, it's called the Old Buggers Award.
Right, okay. And so we're really fortunate that he would also like today to particularly focus some things around ageing in place in communities. But also he's very willing to answer questions about anything you would like to throw something at him about. So welcome, thank you for being here. And just before I really do hand over to Peter, I'd just like to bring everyone in. So perhaps if Andrea, I see you're there from Dandaragan, could I ask you to start, and then if we could just ask everyone to say your name and what centre you're from and what the weather's like where you are today. Andrea?
Oh, sorry, we can't hear you, Andrea.
Still can't hear you.
Sorry. I'm from Dandaragan. The weather is chilly here today and we've got the wildflowers just starting to come out. And I believe you visited here a while back, Peter, and formed our group called Advanced Dandaragan that is still going strong.
I think that was about 15 years ago, actually. So a while ago. But I've got great memories of Dandaragan. I think it's a stunning part of the world.
Thanks, Andrea. And who else have we got? Well, Kay in Hopeton.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes, you can. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Normally it would be our manager, Corinna Smallman, here, but she's not well this week, so I'm very happy to stand in, and we're hoping that Peter will be our guest speaker via Skype at our AGM to promote our very good video conferencing facility. So I'm looking forward to that too. The sun's shining here. What has been touted as the biggest and best wildflower show in the world has started, and this is our very busy month. So we're all on the go here.
Fantastic.
Well done.
Thanks, Kay. And John in Bridgetown.
Hi, Liz. Hi, Peter. John Nicholas.
Hi, John.
I'm manager here at the Bridgetown CRC. We're still waiting for spring. It's still raining and it's still quite chilly. So I guess for us, a pretty normal winter rather than the drier and warmer winters we've been having over the last few years.
I had a house for 25 years in Greenbushes, Bridgetown, so I know many of those cold and chilly kind of like days, but beautiful days.
Absolutely. Better known as Bridgetown. Better known as Bridgetown during this time of the year.
Yeah. Okay, so staying down south, what about, is it Linda in Walpole?
Hi, I am the operations manager down here at Walpole, and Cherie is our new general manager. So this is her first video link. Our weather is still wet, blustery, cold, but it's lovely and quiet in town, at least for another week or so before we start getting more tourists into town. It's quite a busy month for us as well.
Nice. Welcome. And so who have we got at Beacon? Is that Diane? I can't see very well. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi, I'm Diane. Out at Beacon. We've been flat out for the last couple of months with tourists with the wildflower season this year, because it's just absolutely beautiful out here, and we'll probably be busy for the next couple of months because we've got a big concert coming up in October, and yeah, so we've got busy times ahead.
Thank you. And so queriting, is that Jill?
Mm-hmm. Hello.
Hi.
I'm Jill, and we've got Joe, and the heater is working.
Okay. And so who have we got at Williams? I'm just trying to...
Hazel.
Hazel, yep. Hi.
Yeah, no, Hazel at Williams. Wet and cold. Still waiting for spring, as they are most around the state. Yeah, looking forward to catching up with a few people in October at the Link Quest event. That'll be really good.
Great. Yeah, we're looking forward to that too. Great. And so at Dowran, what have we got there?
Hi, from Darren, this is Lindley and Diane.
Hi.
Hi everybody. We've got spring. We've had over 200 visitors to the visitor centre in the last 4 to 6 weeks, and we're sending them your way, Diane, at Beacon. Nice to welcome you today, Peter. We had our AGM last night, so we were all ready and raring to go for the new year and to find out what the new contract will require us to do. So thanks for the opportunity today.
Right, well, it's lovely to have you here. And I will now hand over to Peter, and just to say that we've been chatting a little bit about it, so Peter's happy to field questions at any time. If you just raise your hand, and if we don't see you between Joanna and Peter and I, then shout. And yeah, without further ado, welcome Peter. Thank you for being here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Look, thanks very much, Liz, and thanks, Joanne, for the opportunity of just sharing a bit about my journey with this thing called asset-based community development, or what I prefer to call asset-based community-driven. I think probably summarises the concept for me a lot better. Can I begin also by just also acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're on. I live in Kalamunda, part of Noongar country, and I certainly want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the world that we are sharing where you are. Can I also just say that, as Liz said, I'd rather we make this as informal as possible. And so please, let's make it our workshop, not just a presentation from me. So at any stage you want to ask a question, but even more important, want to make an observation or share an insight, or above all, share a story. I think at the end of the day, we all learn far more than we do from the theory and facts that actually get shared. So please at any stage intervene. This is kind of like our conversation, not just me kind of like delivering a few thoughts. I've been on this thing called community for a long time. I'm probably nearing half a century of being caught up in this thing called community development. And I suppose as I reflect back on it, I've been through different phases. I probably started in a really good space. I started initially as a detached youth worker. In fact, I was working in the East End of London, working in a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week youth centre. It was run by the Anglican Church, and I still remember I worked under this amazing youth leader called Snowy DeVell. And I can remember when I first started, Snowy took me aside and said, Peter, whatever you do for the rest of your career in this area called community or / youth development or whatever, try to remember 3 things. And the first thing is, he said, remember your job is to make everybody feel a somebody. He was one of those guys who just believed that everyone was needed, that everyone had gifts, that everyone had a contribution, and that our job was actually to open doors and windows for people to contribute and to stand up and do that. The second thing he said to me, Peter, never do anything for anyone they can do for themselves. Don't rob people of kind of like getting engaged in stuff. And the third bit of advice he gave me is that your job, Peter, is really to discover what it is that people care about. Not your agenda, not what you want to kind of like do, but what is it that people that you're working with kind of like care about? Because you know what, Peter, he said, that's their motivation to act. Discover what they care about, because that is their motivation to act. And I've always remembered those 3 simple bits of advice. Not that I've always practiced it. As I got involved in this stuff, I got absorbed in this helping industry that I think the community development sector has tended to go down. I very much saw that we were there to really help people who were struggling in different ways, and our job was to kind of like be a helper. But I've begun to realise, particularly in probably the last decade, that there's a bit of a shadow side to helping people, and that I probably ignored that advice that Snowy DeVille gave me all those years ago. And I suppose in the last decade in particular, I've really tried to correct how I engage. I think I've gone back to recognising that our job in community development is not to help people. It's to create a different kind of community for all of us, where each of us kind of like have a role. And I suppose that's where this thing called ABCD, asset-based, community-driven type of approach, has kind of like helped me to understand the lens that I need to look through and try to work through. By that, I mean an approach that really doesn't look at people as a consumer of what we're going to do for them. But actually, we see people that were working as co-owners and kind of like designers, and actually co-producers of what's actually going on within their own community. I've been particularly helped, and I'm sure those of you who participated in this previous Link West, particularly with Jim Diaz and Cormac Russell, would have been aware, both of them probably shared, that our starting point in all this was actually to embrace the philosophy of these 2 guys called Knight and Jody. They were 2 academics who were given really the ultimate research job for 3 years in the early 1990s, when they fundamentally went out and they sat down and they talked to people across 20 cities. Something like 300 neighbourhoods attached to 20 cities in the United States. The question was fundamentally, share with us stories of when your community was at its best. Share stories with us about when you and your neighbours undertook change and made things happen in a positive way. And I suppose what they discovered through all of those stories, 3,000 of those stories in total, was that there were a couple of things in common that seemed to come through over and over. One was simply the fact that it happened when people who lived in that community, decided to take responsibility for their own future. When they stopped waiting for the cavalry to turn up, or in modern lingo, waiting for that Lottery West cheque to kind of like drop through the letterbox, and started themselves to kind of like take responsibility. And secondly, they started with what they had. They started with the assets. They started with the capacities that they found within the community. They actually believed that the capacities and the assets within that community were far, far more important than any external funding, any external assets that might come from the outside. And I suppose these 2 guys have really kind of like helped me to understand the type of lens that I need to look through and kind of like seek as I seek to work with people. So much of what I was doing things to and for people. Sometimes it was with people, But I've come to the conclusion the power in community is when it is of and by the people. And that really my role increasingly was to try to create space where people themselves started to engage the of and by the community themselves. And in many ways, I've gone back to those three basic bits of advice that guy so many years ago, Snowy Devell, actually kind of like shared with me. And I suppose that's why I particularly embrace this thing called asset-based community development. Now, the thing about it is it's not a recipe, it's not a cookie-cutter type of model that you can just dump onto every community. But it does have a set of principles, and there is kind of like these underlying themes that are associated with it that I've found very useful. First is that it's strongly appreciative. It actually starts with the half full, not the half empty bit of the glass. So much of my work was to kind of like start with what was wrong with people or what was wrong with community. I spent a whole decade heading employment services here in WA. And we were like a cavalry that used to go into community and do things to and for. We saw people as lacking in jobs and employment, and our job was to kind of like open that up. It seemed to me that what we ignored in the process was the type of contribution that people could actually bring to it. And so increasingly I see a lot of our work is not so much starting with what's wrong in the community, but what is strong in the community. And so it has a strong appreciative type of approach to it. I love that Snoopy kind of like cartoon where Charlie Brown says, you know what, Snoopy, one day we're all going to die. Snoopy responds by saying, true, but on all the other days we will not. And it just seems to me that looking at the half full, not the half empty bit of the glass actually does make a difference. The second thing about the appreciative aspect is that it is about unashamedly trying to discover the assets that we have in the community. For too long I've spent too much time telling people to do a needs map, work out what doesn't work in the community, what's missing in the community. And if you actually almost look at every application to any philanthropic group today, the number one question is, what problem are you going to solve? What need are you going to fix? Well, I've come to the conclusion, maybe we've got that wrong. Maybe the first question is, what is it we've got in community that we can start with? And in every community, there is just this incredible, countless range of kind of like assets that every community has. Firstly, there are people in the community, every one of them have got backgrounds and skills and passions and hobbies and whatever. When you start to discover that, it's going back to what Snowy talked about. Start with what people care about, and probably the greatest asset you've got to discover in any community is what people actually care about. And then there are the physical assets, and then there are the networking assets, and then there's all that institutional assets, and then there are the stories and cultural assets. And so very much this approach is saying, look, start with the half full, not the half empty. Start with what's there, not what isn't there. And I particularly found that really helpful. The second aspect, and it's that latter part of the definition, the citizen-driven bit, just is about bottom-up, inside-out type of approach. This is about citizens beginning to kind of like take action and being actually in the driving seat. I today believe that we've created a sense of community that's a little bit akin to sitting at Optus Stadium watching the Dockers play a footy game. That's pretty depressing, particularly if you're a Docker fan for the last year. But I'll never forget being there a few weeks ago, the last game of the season. And I go with my young daughter, and I can remember saying to Ellie, sitting here reminds me about how we do community. Fundamentally, 30,000 people who need the exercise turning up to watch 36 players who don't. And it just seems to me that that model, that approach to community development, I actually think has been highly destructive to community. Today, community development seems to be the preserve of the professional. And it just seems to me that the professionals need a little bit by stepping back. I think the professionals in this model is really there, as I keep saying, to open doors and windows for people to kind of like step up and start becoming an active player and an active kind of like participant within community. I think the society we've created has reinforced that. I notice in local government now that we call people customers. In the health system, we now call people consumers. NGOs tend to call people clients. Well, you know what? I think we need citizens. What I think is that we actually need co-owners and co-producers. You call someone a customer, they'll act like a customer. You know, I don't know who was the smart person who came up with in local government that we should now kind of like treat people as customers. Well, you know, I'm a ratepayer. You should be doing this for me, rather than what it is that we as a community can actually start to do. So this whole model of ABCD tries to turn a lot where we're at as a current society on its head. We don't need more kind of like clients. We don't need more consumers. We don't need more kind of like customers. What we do need a lot more citizens, people who take action with other people to kind of like make a difference. And certainly this model really pushes that. The third aspect of the ABCD model is that it's very strongly relationship orientated. You know, the starting point, I think, in community building is relationship building. It is about getting people connected with each other. It is about people starting to see their value in relationship to kind of like each other. And again, I think we as a society generally are really now struggling from kind of like people who just have not got those relationships. I find it incredible that today that our Minister for Aged Care, Ken Wyatt, could say that somewhere between 40 and 60% of people in a nursing home never get a visitor. Well, you know what? I think loneliness is probably the greatest issue that we as a modern society are facing. And what community building is about is reconnecting people with each other. So again, I'm drawn to this model because it has this strong kind of like sense of relationship building. I love what Relationships Australia says. Their logo is that the type of community you want starts at your front door. And I suppose what I'm interested in is how do we actually start really getting people reconnected with each other? How do we actually start rebuilding communities street by street? And certainly this ABCD model has actually helped me to understand that. The fourth aspect about ABCD that appeals to me is it's very much place-based, not silo-based. And again, I think the way that we have structured this thing called community development is very much now where we actually divide people's lives into their recreation bit, into their cultural bit, into their employment bit, into their health bit, and then we have all these agencies who then also operate like silos. What we actually need is to kind of like bring people together, not like create wedges within community. And so that whole thing about how do we actually become place-based as opposed to kind of like silo-based is a really appealing thing. The fifth aspect of this whole model is that it's conversation initiated. We again, I think in community development are meeting obsessed. The way we bring people together is to organise a meeting where usually, 50 people sitting in a room like they're in church in rows, watching someone out the front with their flip chart paper and whatever. It ain't a conversation. It ain't really a meaningful way to get people involved. And what I've found is that the power of getting people around a table and getting people using the oldest tool in the toolbox of community building called conversation is incredibly powerful. And so one of the things that ABCD has helped me understand is that my number one role probably is to host meaningful learning conversations between people. That our main job is to get people engaged in conversation actually with each other. And the final aspect of this whole ABCD that really appeals to me is it's gift obsessive. It actually believes that everyone has a contribution, that everyone has gifts, and that our job is to kind of like discover and connect those gifts with other people. And I suppose that's what we need to go into. I do have one final kind of like characteristic that I need to mention, and that is that it is also fun-based. I think too much of what we do in community development is boring. We've recently done a survey of why people stop volunteering, particularly in the emergency services sector, and this was in New South Wales. It's interesting, when we interviewed people who'd given up being an emergency service person, they gave us a whole pile of reasons why they dropped out. But overwhelmingly, the number one reason why people stopped volunteering was that it was no longer fun. It was no longer fun to be part of. And I think, again, we look at how few people actually meaningfully engage in community. And I think we've got to get back to how do we actually make this kind of like an exciting kind of like thing to actually be engaged in and whatever. People tell me they don't get involved because they're time poor. Well, still people on average watch 3 hours of television a night. And I was in a motel the other week and I turned the TV on for the first time, I reckon, in 3 months, and thought, if that's the competition, we must be doing really bad. So how do we get back to kind of like organising people's engagement in fun and in exciting and in ways? And I suppose these are the set of kind of like 7 principles that certainly McKnight and Kretzmann have actually taught me that this whole thing's actually about. How we apply that, well, it'll vary from place to place and vary from group to group. As Liz said at the start, I had this dubious honour of being the West Australian Senior Citizen, which I refer to as the Old Buggers Award last year. And one of the casualties of that, or one of the consequences of that, not the casualty, the consequences, I've been asked to go and address so many provosts and retirement and senior cits kind of like groups. And so I came up with a bit of a standard presentation called Remember the Good Old Days? Well, you know what? We can get those back. And you know what? You're the ones we've actually been waiting for. And basically started talking to people about how do we, as people in our ageing years, begin to recognise we have some amazing kind of like contributions and gifts and capacities that we need to kind of like give back. We who are the baby boomers have lived in the most kind of like the best kind of like era possible. We're probably the most blessed kind of like generation this world has ever seen and may ever see in terms of the opportunities and what we have been able to experience. And what I say to people of my generation is, you know what, we can get back to kind of like creating those good old days that many of us remember back in the 1950s and 60s. We can get back. But it is about creating community once again. It is about people starting to reconnect. Like, it ain't good enough that only 1 in 3 people in WA now can tell you the name of their neighbours on either side. To me, that ain't a way to kind of like create community. It ain't good that only 1 in 3 people actually trust their neighbours. It ain't good that, you know, somewhere between 40 and 50% in the nursing home never get a visitor. I saw a statistic also the other day that really scared me, and that is that today people have 4 to 5 less close friends that they can count on than they did back in the 1980s. What's happened? I think we have lost a sense of community. And to me, it's about how do we, and particularly it's great being with people in the Community Resource Centre network because you're in such a vital and strategic position within community. How do we start getting people reconnected back to community? Not necessarily connected to your services and your programs, but how do we connect people to community? And to me, that must be the overwhelming kind of like focus. How do we get people beginning to see that the critical thing that we need to do is to rebuild the sense and people's kind of like role and contribution within community? And to me, this thing, asset-based community development, has provided us with a philosophical approach with its set of principles that enables some of that stuff to actually happen. I'm trying, as I said, to start to apply some of this stuff when it comes to the ageing. And maybe if I just finish my little introduction and spiel with sharing with you that in a number of communities now, one of those is in a regional centre, one of those is within my own home set of communities in Kalamunda, and the third is in a small country town where we're trying to apply this, and that's Pingelly, where we're now starting to say, you know what, it's interesting that there's 3.1 million Australians who are 65 years and over. interesting fact is that only 400,000 of that 3.1 million are actually in any form of retirement or aged care facility. The vast bulk of people are still living somewhere in community. In fact, only 1 in 4 85-year-old happens to be in an aged care facility. 3 out of 4 of them are still living with families, still living on their own, still living in some capacity. And what we're looking at is a model, and most people, I find, want to continue to do that. Most people do not want to move into some form of aged care facility. They want to keep living as long as they can within their own home and their own street and their own neighbourhood. Now, there's no real program or service that's going to enable that to happen. What there is this thing called community. And so one of the little initiatives we're starting to explore is one that's been taken up in America, and they're called virtual villages. And it's where across the neighbourhood or across the small town, you start connecting people with each other, literally in a virtual village. And you begin to identify people who are willing to volunteer to support older people, tradespeople who are willing to do special deals for older people, and what each older person has to bring that could actually contribute to the to the village. We have that famous African expression, it takes a village to raise a child. What we've done is to now modify that and to say it takes the village to support a person to age well and safely. And so how do we start to wrap community around people, not just keep thinking we can keep wrapping services and programs around people? And I suppose that's where now in my life, after all these years in this thing that I find myself really now starting to say, we've got to be a lot more creative. We've got to rediscover again this amazing thing called community. To me, after family, nothing matters more than this thing called community. But we've got to start to do it. And you don't do it by doing things to and for people. It does help to do it with people, but more important, it is about how do we create space of and by the people themselves. And so I go back to those simple 3 lessons that Snowy DeVille taught me 50 years ago. Peter, your job is to make sure everybody feels for somebody. Secondly, don't do anything for anyone they can do for themselves. And thirdly, your job is to discover what people care about and not what your agenda is actually all about. And so to me, it's back to that, and certainly this thing called asset-based community development enables me to gives me a lens to look through and a set of processes to try to put that into practice. So there endeth the sermon for the day, the homily from the Catholic priest, and perhaps at this stage we might throw it open to you for your observations around this thing called community and how do we actually strengthen it.
Yes, hi. It's very lovely, but is there any way, have you got an example of something that you've done on this formula that's worked? I understand the concept, but I can't see how it's practically done. Could you give me an example of something that you've experienced?
Look, I hope I picked up what you said. It came across quite broken. So what you're asking for is perhaps some examples. And look, I love telling stories, and I think, as you said, far better than the theory is how does this work in practice. I'll never forget, I was working, as I said, I headed the employment services here in WA for almost a decade. And I was the youngest director in the senior public service in WA, and I decided to resign. I'd had enough of doing things to and for people. I'd had enough of the bureaucracy, and I decided I just wanted to walk away from it. And I had a few friends who said, Peter, you need to be careful of the step you're taking, and you probably just need to take a break and have a holiday. And I said, great, I love holidays. And they gave me they encouraged me to go, and I headed out across the globe to visit a pile of community projects. I wanted to reconnect, I think, once again with community. And I'll never forget, someone encouraged me to visit a project in a neighbourhood just out of Cincinnati in the United States. It was actually a Baptist church that used to put on a whole pile of community development projects. And I'll never forget arriving at the airport in Cincinnati, and the first thing I discovered was that no taxi would take me to this neighbourhood. They kept saying to me, "You want to get killed? This is the worst neighbourhood we have in the whole city." I ended up, I think, having to pay about 4 times the normal rate to kind of like get there. When I got there, I discovered it wasn't any kind of like church, it wasn't any Baptist church, it was actually a black Baptist church. And thirdly, what I was sent to see wasn't what they did on a Sunday, but what they actually did every night of the week. They ran a soup kitchen for 200 homeless and unemployed people. And I thought to myself, oh, hum-ha, you know, I've come all the way around the world and ended up here, and it's taken me a lot of effort to get here. To see a soup kitchen. I thought I knew all about soup kitchens. I'd actually worked as a volunteer in a soup kitchen. And I have huge respect for people who run soup kitchens. I think it's one of the ultimate expressions in compassion that we can actually give. But most soup kitchens, to be quite honest, are community feeding centres. When I walked into this one, this was no community feeding centre. This was a community eating centre. And the difference being, I couldn't work out who were the well-meaning churchies running this place and who were the 200 homeless and unemployed. What I saw when I walked in and experienced that night was over 200 people having a meal together and sharing and doing things together. And I was just blown away. It was the most amazing night. And things happened that night that I'd never seen in a soup kitchen before. For example, it had its own resident jazz band. Well, I'd never been in a soup kitchen that had a resident jazz band. It had its resident comedian. People got up and did amazing things. This was just an amazing night. And I had amazing conversations around the table. And I couldn't wait for the end of the night to have a conversation with the pastor. His name was Damon Lynch III, an Afro-American with a ponytail right down past his bum. I'd never seen a Baptist minister like that before. And I can remember saying to Damon, "Damon, tell me the story, mate. What's gone on here?" And he said, "Well, if you'd been here 6 months ago, you would have seen a typical soup kitchen. 200 homeless people came in, we fed them, we gave them a wonderful meal, they went out and we felt good. And then next day, 200 people came back, we fed them, and we took them out of the cold elements of the Cincinnati winter. We felt good, they went out. But you know what? Next night they were back again, and we fed them. And that's how we ran the soup kitchen." Well, then I made the ultimate mistake. I employed a young woman, and he said, "You know what all Generation Y women are like? They only need to be in a place for 2 minutes before they want to change everything." And so this young woman, Joanne, said to me one night, "You know what, Pastor, we do a good job, but guess what, Pastor? Their lives are not changing. They're here tonight and they're back tomorrow night. And do you know why their lives are not changing? Because we do not know them." And Damon said, "I was furious. I was angry. I'd been here 6 years. She's been here 6 minutes." But the more I reflected on her comments, the more I realised she was right. And so he did an interesting thing. He had a little asset in his church called Young Women and Men. It was a teenage youth club of about 20 young people. They were aged 13 and 14. And he taught them a tool. It's one of the tools that we use a lot in asset-based community development. It's called appreciative inquiry. And it's a way of holding a conversation with a group or a person or an organisation where you drill into the positive core, not the negative core. You ask questions that bring out the best of people's experiences, not the worst of people's experiences. And so he taught them how to just go in and over a 2-week period sit down and have a meal with different subgroups of these homeless and unemployed people and use a set of questions. Not one of the questions was about unemployment and not one of the questions was about homelessness. They were all about what's good about you and what is it you love doing as a young person and what's the one gift that you think you could contribute. And if you could do something to start up a business, what would it actually be based on what you're interested in or care about? What is it you care about? The first thing Damon told me he discovered was out of 200 people, over 100 of them said they like cooking. And yet here was a soup kitchen where 25 churches came in and did the cooking. And the 200 homeless were recipients of what they did for them. Damon immediately put an end to that. He sacked the 25 church members and immediately invited 25 of the group to take over all the catering. He said the interesting thing is that within 6 months, every single one of those 25 is working somewhere in the hospitality industry. It wasn't meant to be an employment program, just happened to happen that way. Why did I see a jazz band the night I was there? Well, out of 200 people, over 50 of them had played a musical instrument at some stage in their life. And we started to link them up. The night that I was there, I had a conversation with a guy who said, as a kid, I love fishing. I've been through police checks and I now take 2 boys from a single parent family who don't have an adult male role model and I take them fishing once a week. That's my contribution. And I'll always remember the words of Damon Lynch III. He said, Peter, we were feeding folks, but not getting to know them. And I suppose to me it's one of those great examples of this stuff actually in practice. How do we start with what is there and what people can contribute? And I think the ABCD model is about inviting people to share their gifts and opening doors and windows to enable that stuff to happen. I think in the community service industry, we are too busy doing things to and for people, too busy running services and programs that we've forgotten. This is about engaging people themselves in the process. How do we move people from being customers and consumers and clients to becoming citizens, co-owners of what is actually happening? It is about that participation and it is about contribution. And that stuff happens in relationships. And so to me, that kind of like little example is one of the best that I actually know of what could happen. Another is the second best country town I know in WA after the one that you come from. There's a little place called Coolin. I can remember 25 years ago, where our little town there, population was around about 286, and about 70 people gathered one night in a community hall, not to talk about what they didn't have, but to talk about what they did have. And that night they made a bond to say, we are no longer going to be a dot on the map, and we're going to instigate based on what we have that is unique in this place, a place where people will feel proud, a place where people would want to keep their kids at the local school and where people may want to retire rather than retiring to the coast. And over the last 23 years, that little town of Coolin has totally reinvented itself. Its population today is around about 575. They've doubled their population. When I look at what went on in Coolin, they started to look at what they did have in terms of facilities, in terms of land, in terms of ideas, in terms of how they could reinvent community. And I need to say it's been driven by the citizens of Coolin, not outside forces. Sure, they've been opportunists to grab anything they can from the outside, but the starting point with what's unique, what's special with us, i.e., we aren't that far from Wave Rock, but we're on an alternative rough road. What difference would it make if we started to actually bitumise that road and create an alternative route to Wave Rock? What is it that we could do to kind of like get that alternative? Well, you know, we've got this bush races and people have started doing these crazy tin horses. Let's create the tin horse highway and how we might actually use that. Story after story. The fact that the very first conscript ever killed in the Vietnam War was a Corporal Hart. His parents ran the post office in Coolin. So they created Camp Hart, a place that would enable Vietnam vets to come and see that Coolin was one of these Vietnam vet-friendly towns and created that campsite that almost every weekend finds some Vietnam family or set of families kind of like camping out and whatever. Interesting to just see how they started to look within and not what was actually often out. Today, communities across this state constantly have visions of what they want to become, and the first question is, who is going to fund it? Can we get a Lottery West grant to do it type stuff? And I'm saying, look, Lottery West plays a vital role in resourcing us, but the starting point is to asset map our own community. Let's begin to discover what it is that we have internally. This stuff is internally driven, not externally funded. It's kind of like the incredible part of the process. So those two little examples hopefully kind of like illustrate to me this stuff kind of like in action.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Any other observations from your own community? Any other good examples that you might have in Beacon or in Beachtown or in Hopeton?
Well, okay. I don't know whether we've got shining examples, but I know that with some of our problems, not just of the ageing, the situation with the age, but a lot of small communities are struggling with people who are addicted. And I seem to think that actually there might be an answer in there in how a community can support a family or families. And I think there must be examples of that, Peter, somewhere in Australia where a small community has said, enough's enough, we can't rely on the government, we're going to have to do something ourselves for this scourge, you know, to help either the families or the individuals. Do you know anything about any of those examples?
Yeah, and unfortunately, Kay, I don't know any examples within the addiction area. I'm sure there would be, because I think increasingly people are beginning to say, whatever the issue, community, not government, not the latest funding program, but community is the answer. And I think people are starting to look at that. Now, a related but not exactly what you're talking about is that I'm currently working with the West Australian Primary Health Alliance with a couple of pilot projects. One of them is going to be in the Midwest and one of them is in Mandurah around the whole area of suicide prevention. Now, traditionally we have pumped a huge amount of money into treating kind of like the problem of depression and supporting professional people to better understand and support people and whatever. And I suppose what we are attempting to do in these pilots though is to say, let's continue to do that, but how do we also recognise that what's needed is to wrap community actually more around people. And so we're actually starting to look and take a number of sub-communities, geographic communities, and start to talk about how do we better connect people in that community to recognise elements of depression and potential kind of like suicidal behaviours, but also how do we actually start wrapping a sense of friendship and community and people's engagement actually with each other. No different to the ageing. I had a friend recently had to do an ageing strategy in South Australia, and her way to get out some raw material was to identify 50 houses where older people lived. And she turned up at the door and knocked on the door, and then as the older person or the older couple opened the door, she said, "Are you excited about moving into a nursing home?" Well, half of them kind of like almost dropped dead at the door, and as she lifted them up, she said, only teasing you, but tell me, what do you reckon would delay you needing to move into a nursing home? You know what came out at the top of the list of 50 people? Love it if someone dropped in and had a cup of tea with me once a week. Don't see anyone these days. Don't see the next door neighbour. The kids live in Sydney. Feeling pretty lonely. Just love it if someone come and had a cup of tea with me. And the second thing on the list, be great if someone could just help me with the wheelie bin. Now, that does not need a service. That does not need a program. That needs community. And it seems to me, whatever the issue, whether it be ageing, depression, or drug addiction, we need to start looking at how do we increasingly wrap kind of like community around people. I was talking to my daughter about this. She has this amazing border collie dog. She said, "Dad, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go, and there was the potential for this dog to just go to a couple of sessions, be trained as a therapy dog, and she takes this dog once a fortnight into a dementia, kind of like aging care, and she just spends a couple of hours going from bed to bed with this dog. Now, this dog is the most adoring border collie, as they all are, who just absolutely loves just hopping up and just staring and engaging with people and whatever. And I thought to myself, you know what, Elle, it's as simple as that, isn't it? You've got an asset, you recognise you've got some time, how can we just actually do that? Instead of running the playgroup every day in the same one, why not once a week let's run the playgroup in an ageing facility where the older people engage with the kids and whatever. You know, there's so many simple ways that we could start to connect people again in community. We used to do it. We need to get back to doing it. And I believe within the addiction area, it's one of the areas that we just need to kind of like look at. What are some of those community responses? Because as you said, it is becoming a scourge in many of our country towns now. And just as the suicide issue and the depression issue is kind of like part of it as well. How can we actually do that?
Thank you. Thank you.
That was a long-winded answer to a very simple question without actually...
Oh, not a simple question, Peter, I don't think. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Can I just say one more thing?
Yep.
We've got Seniors Week coming up. It's in November this year, and the Hopetown Senior Citizens are going to have a picnic in the Fitzgerald River National Park, which has just achieved heritage status. And we thought we need to somehow get younger people involved. So we've decided that we'll approach the school and ask them if they, with one of their aides, we could have perhaps half a dozen children who are interested to come on the picnic with the seniors and help those who might be a little unsteady on their feet and so forth and so on. So I'm looking forward to that as a way of connecting the youngest in the community with the oldest.
Yeah, and look, I'm into any of those type of initiatives. Two good examples of that people shared with me recently. Only last week I was down in, just out of Bunbury, there's a community there called Del Yella that we're working with between Bunbury and Capel, and talking to the Baptist minister there, and he was talking about the fact that at the school in Mandurah, the Baptist college there, all year 6 and 7s, as part of their community service year, actually spend a double period every week working with different older people in the community, whether within an aged care facility or just going and visiting someone in the home, but they're actually supported to build a friendship. The other one I really love, someone shared with me that each year in a particular aged care facility in a country town, all of the year 9 students are attached and become a peer buddy to one of the people within it. And part of their job over that year is to write their memoirs and to sit down and write up the memoirs, and then the school prints it up into a book, and there is a book launch for every older person where the author, the young person, and his or her family and friends come, and the older person invites their family and friends, and the memoirs is launched as a book. And I thought, wow, what a brilliant idea. What a way to just get people connected. You know, as at the end of the day, the stuff called community development is all about relationship building. And in this case, how do we, younger and older, kind of like connected with each other? It's incredibly powerful in terms of it.
We've probably got time for about 1 or 2 more quick questions if anyone does have any.
What about you and Dan Darrigan? Look like you're freezing cold up there. And have you got a question from Dan Darrigan?
I was going to ask you, does the World Cafe sort of fit into the model of ABCD?
Look, the World Cafe, or what some of us call cafe conversation, is one of the tools that many of us use. And the reason for it is that sixth principle I talked about, the fact that this is conversation initiated rather than meeting kind of like directed, is important. How do we get people into conversation? And what the value of the cafe conversation, or the World Cafe, is that you bring people together. And recently I was in one in New Zealand. We had 500 people in a room. But you know what? They were in tables of 5 people. So we had 100 tables of 5. And people were having a conversation around the table. Well, 5 people do have a conversation. 500 people don't have a conversation. Most people in a group of 500 listen to a few people in the airwaves. What the cafe conversation does is get people around the table. You're simulating the coffee shop. And really, when we go to a coffee shop, we have more than 5 people. We have this incredible, meaningful conversation. And so the concept of World Cafe or cafe conversation is simply borrow why people love hanging out in coffee shops. It's all about conversation. And part of it is get people into a circle, round a table, no more than 5. Use the tablecloth to note stuff and to doodle. That's a great way to kind of like capture. And then the other principle of World Cafe is what we call shuffle the pack. So you might have the key question that you're wanting people around all your tables to talk about, but you have sub-questions related to that main question. And at the end of each round, which might be 12, 14, 20 minutes, you then identify one person on the table to remain, i.e., you know, find the person who's got the funkiest pair of socks. Well, obviously they're the most creative person at the table. We appoint you as the host of the table. Everyone else hop up and move to a new table. And what you're doing is shuffling the pack. And you got, and in this case, it was 500 people in Christchurch, all moving all over the place. It was crazy. It was chaotic. It was fantastic. People actually loved it. And I think that the methodology called World Cafe or Cafe Conversation is a great tool to use to particularly get people into meaningful conversation. And as I said, at the end of the day, our job, I think, as people who work in community building, our number one job, I believe, is to host meaningful conversations between people. And World Cafe enables us to do that.
We've just had a book club that's been going for quite some time, and the volunteer that runs that book club for us, the numbers have dropped off, and I went back and I asked the people that were participating why, and the volunteer was choosing the book for them rather than allowing them to have a decision. Yeah. And that's why a lot of people stopped coming. And the volunteer was choosing books that suited the age group, what she thought suited. So they were doing war topics and olden day topics, and they didn't want to read that sort of thing. So we've decided to revamp that group, and we're thinking about turning it into like a World Cafe where we can have a different topic and engage those older people in some really meaningful conversation.
Yeah, and look, that would be perfect for it. And I think your analysis of what's actually happened is just a great expression of what we've actually been talking about today. It's a great story of that in action. And so often it's our agenda that dominates, not really. And I think our critical role is to discover what it is that people care about. And who else cares about that? And how do we actually get those people actually together? Again, I always remember this guy, Snowy DeVal, and as I said, it was 50 years ago I worked under this guy as a young, I won't tell you how, I was in my late teens and whatever, and I can remember he had this wonderful analogy. He said, you know what, people don't make friends and contribution by standing in the queue for the sandwiches. They make friends by making the sandwiches. And I always remember that, and I think, you know, so often we rob people of that participation because we decide, we can determine, we do things to and for people. how do we actually create space of and by the people themselves? So the analogy of it's much better to be making the sandwich than standing in the queue waiting for the sandwich. A lot better relationships happen in the making bit than in the queue waiting for it. And I think that's the same analogy you're using with someone who determines what the books are and all of that type of stuff. But yeah, give it a go. I think you'll love it. There's some really useful little short YouTubes about how to run effective Will Cafes happening. If you go on to our Bank of Ideas resource page, there's a 2-pager called Clues to Running an Effective Cafe Conversation, and it attempts to summarise a lot of that advice for you. But I've never run a public meeting now, I reckon, for 5 years since I discovered World Cafe. I say to people, I'm more than happy to come and host a cafe conversation, but don't ask me to come and address a public meeting where we all sit there and I stand out the front and talk to you. Get people engaged. And the best way to do it is around a circle and no more than 5 at the table. 5 is perfect. 6 is 1 too many. 12 is far too many.
Okay, I saw that you had your hand up for a second. We've got about 45 seconds.
I'm just wondering whether Peter would set as his topic for our AGM World Cafes, because I've never heard the term before. But I'm going to suss it out, but I think there'd be a lot of interest in it as a tool.
Right. Well, maybe I could speak on, probably more important than World Cafe, the tool, is the importance of rediscovering the power of conversation. The importance of conversation. It's the oldest tool we have in the toolbox for building community. And as I said, I think our roles, particularly those of us working in places like community resource centres, the number one thing we've got to do is to be a host of meaningful learning conversations. And certainly the World Cafe allows us to do that, and perhaps I can just share that and a few other kind of like methodologies that people have discovered too. How do we enhance this thing called conversation? Why does conversation matter? I think it's one of the things we've got to rediscover. It's the glue that brings community together, because as someone said, without conversation we can't have community.
Okay, well, that's a really good place to stop. I mean, I can see that there's probably a lot more questions and a lot more conversation to be had. So could I invite people, if you do have more questions, if you could send them through to Joanna, and we can see whether we can come back to them in the next session or in some way access Peter's generosity, because that seems to be always on offer. Thank you so very much, Peter, for being part of this session. And
thanks, Joanne. And thank each of you.
And thank you very much for everyone for being here. Look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you. Go well.
Bye. Bye.
Go well. Take care. Yeah. Speak soon, Kate.